Tracy, welcome to Podcastina.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Thanks so much for doing the show. Would you mind just letting people know what it is that you work with?
So, I'm a sleep therapist and I work exclusively with adults who have insomnia. And I've been doing that for a number of years via Zoom. Very, very rewarding work.
How is it that we know that we're not sleeping well?
Usually, it is based on how we feel. If we are, say, struggling to fall asleep within 15 or 20 minutes, we're waking up for long periods at night, we have choppy sleep. Those are some indicators. But the biggest indicator is how we feel during the day. Do we have enough energy, focus, concentration, emotional stability to live the kind of life that we really need? Now, more and more people are reverting to their devices to tell them how they slept. And I tend to encourage people to not go based by what your watch or your app says, but to really focus on how you're feeling.
I was actually going to ask you what your thoughts are on Aura rings and Apple Watches and all of that. Why is that not a good tool to measure the quality of our sleep?
For one, they are not accurate. They are getting better, and certain elements of them are more accurate than others. But it tends to be the things that are the least accurate are the things that people put the most stock in. So, for example, everybody gets very fascinated by sleep stages. And simply because a device can provide you some information that is supposedly representing sleep stages, doesn't mean that that information is accurate. And that is the least accurate thing that they all do, is they're not good at estimating sleep stages. The second reason why it's not a good idea to kind of over focus on these things, particularly if you're having difficulty with sleeping, is that over focusing on problems with sleep can actually make your sleep worse over time. This can happen for a number of reasons. Ideally, we want to wake up in the morning and leave sleep behind us and go about our day. But if we begin to start worrying excessively about our sleep based on perhaps not accurate information or data, or maybe information that we've misinterpreted because we don't understand what it's supposed to say, we start worrying about the sleep itself. And that is the number one thing that takes people who have a normal short term bout of sleeplessness. So, say something happens in life and you have a rough patch of sleep. That is the number one predictor of somebody moving into kind of a longer term sleeping difficulty, which is the continued worrying about sleep itself. We call in sleep therapy, we call that a perpetuating factor. So you may have had an incident that creates a short term disruption. If the disruption then becomes the worry about sleep itself, you get stuck in a vicious circle and a vicious cycle. And that is the kind of sleep trouble that I work with people.
Yeah, I get that. I myself am really fortunate, just so my listeners are like, who are you to talk about this? I'm really lucky I don't have sleep issues unless it is circumstantial. If I'm going through grief, let's say, that's the thing that has in the past disrupted my sleep the most. And I do notice kind of needing these weird crutches that then I have to fight to like overcorrect once I'm out of the grief stage. Like typically I'll start falling asleep with the TV on as comfort when I'm going through something. And then I'm not going through it as intensely anymore. And now it's like, well, now I got to cut the TV out of the bedtime routine. So I'd like to just go a little further on this issue of the psychosomatic element of thinking we're not sleeping well and how that's kind of manifesting itself.
Yeah, I mean, it shows up, in particularly if people have paid a lot of money for their watch. And there's actually a term for it called orthosomnia, and it is sleeping issues. It's being fed exclusively by trying to perfect sleep or optimize sleep. But if we're looking at the mind body connection, that the connection between the psychological elements and how that actually interferes with sleep, if we back up many, many, many hundreds of thousands of years, um, we needed a safety system to keep us alive. We would have been great prey for predators if we just slept under a tree for 8 hours solid. They would have just said, oh, we're all going to be nocturnal and we're going to go out and we're just going to eat all the humans at night. We would have been easy prey. So our arousal system's actually built in and baked into the mechanics of our actual sleep. So if you've ever looked at graphs, for example, of what goes on in the brain, We go down into deeper sleep, and then we come up into lighter sleep, and then we go down into deeper sleep, and we come back up into lighter sleep. That's actually our safety system kind of scanning for danger. Is there a tiger nearby, or is there not a tiger nearby? Then I can go back to sleep. So that arousal is meant to override deeper, more satisfying sleep. So, again, in a situation like grief, it's a really good example. Our arousal levels are really high. We either feel distressed, vulnerable, or usually both. And so it makes sense to us, eyebrows up. Our rational human brain can say, oh, I understand why I'm not sleeping. If we have that arousal switched on about not sleeping, that's when we get stuck in that cycle. So that arousal system has to be able to override the sleep, because that's how it's built into A, our sleep, and B, our safety system. It's just that in this modern day, we are not always worried about being chased by tigers, lions, and bears. Especially at least where I live, and perhaps where you live, we're relatively physically safe. And there's not a lot of things that are actually truly threatening to us in that kind of life or death way. But we, with our human brain, get to pick all kinds of things that we can worry about, get stressed about, get upset about, including the discomfort of not sleeping itself.
How important is the REM stage? Because that seems to be a place where I notice people are getting really tripped up and concerned when they are using these products that track sleep. If they're not getting deep REM, that's kind of the thing that I hear a lot of talk about of, oh, I'm not getting deep REM sleep. It's messing everything up for me. Is that really a sign that it's not a good night's sleep?
Well, this is a really good example of why we shouldn't be relying on our watches, because even if they give us a number, for example, 20% REM sleep for a night, people will get really distressed about that, or 25% deep sleep. They'll get very distressed about that and very concerned about their sleep, when actually those percentages would be considered quite normal. We are not meant to spend the whole night in deep sleep. We spend most of the night in lighter stages of sleep, and we cycle through stages of sleep. And when somebody says they're concerned about their deep REM, well, deep is deep, slow wave sleep. REM sleep is right up there close to us being awake. So those two things aren't even the same thing.
Wow.
Um, and so the basis by which people are judging their sleep and whether it's the right kind of sleep is all automatically faulty when we're looking at these devices. Um, because of the inaccuracy, but then also because of the misunderstanding of what's considered kind of normal for a human being and healthy sleep. Is it important for us to get REM sleep? Yes. Is it important for us to get deep sleep? Yes. Is it important for us to get light stage 1 and 2 sleep? Yes. They all have a function. And when you start looking at what happens in sleep, they are just barely scratching the surface. They don't really understand all of the pieces, but there's a lot of progress being made. But what I would say is, if people are concerned about whether they're getting enough of this or enough of that, in studies, when they purposefully deprive people of sleep to do the study, some people will find that the next night that they are allowed to have a full night of sleep, their brain will say, aha, I need deep sleep. That's the thing I need to catch up on. And so they will have deeper sleep until they have caught up on it, and then they will catch up on the REM. And the reverse is true. If somebody actually, that person needs more REM sleep because of the sleep deprivation that they've been experiencing, they will, their brain will say, aha, actually, I really need some REM to catch up on. So I'm going to do the REM catch up. And then they will prioritize that. The brain prioritizes that and then says, okay, and now I need a little bit more deep sleep, and it will catch up on that. So what I would say is, don't overly worry about it. Your brain knows what it needs, and it's going to get what it needs, whether it's comfortable for you or not. And also, another really interesting thing along these lines is that even healthy sleepers who sleep really well aren't always very good at judging whether they're asleep or not, or how long they have slept. If you put healthy sleepers in a lab and you hook them up to all of the devices that you can get hooked up to, and then you ask them, how much did you sleep? They're not terribly accurate. And people who have more difficulty with their sleep, even less accurate. especially in those lighter stages of sleep. If we have a situation where we are concerned about our sleep and we're experiencing a bit of hypervigilance around sleep or hyperarousal, we're that much closer to being awake. We're probably spending more time in lighter sleep, and we have what I call the periscope effect. There's a part of our conscious awareness that is aware of things that are going on around us, but our brain is also getting some sleep. So we can experience thought in light sleep as well. And of course, that gets misinterpreted as being awake, and then people get upset and distressed about it. So it should be reassuring that we don't always know exactly how much sleep we are getting. Usually, people are getting more than they think they are, and that is sometimes taken as very dismissive. It's not meant to be dismissive. That's simply if you look at a bell curve of people who've been studied, that is people's experience. They're getting more than they think they are, whether they are good sleepers or poor sleepers.
Two things on that. One, how cool to know that our brains know what they need and that we need to kind of trust them more to make up in the areas that it wants to make up in. And then the other thing, because I would be remiss not to ask, since people are so obsessed with these tools, even though you're pointing out they're inaccurate, what would, in theory, a decent reading look like? One that someone could wake up to and be like, oh, okay, it went well. I can rest assured that it was a good night's sleep.
Ooh, that depends on a number of factors, particularly age, because we have more slow wave sleep and more REM sleep when we are younger, and we get less of both of those as we get older. And um, there are reference ranges for different age groups. But if you say pick a random person in their 30s, you're probably looking about half, maybe a tiny bit more than half the night in light sleep, uh, maybe a little bit more than half of the remainder of that would be in deeper sleep, and then the rest in REM sleep. As we get older, we don't need the deeper sleep and the REM sleep as much as we did when we were younger. That's what they think. That's one
Mm.
possible explanation for why we don't tend to see like an increasing amount of REM sleep or deeper sleep. And if you think about the one of the hypotheses about what happens in REM sleep is we're doing memory consolidation. Well, if you look at a child, they are learning whether they know they're learning or not, because they are just absorbing so much and they're forming lots of memories and associations. And so they get more of that when they're younger. We don't necessarily need as much of that because of our context and the way we tend to live when we are 75 years old. So that's it's almost like a conservation of greatness on the part of the brain. It says, well, I'm going to pay attention to what I need. I don't need quite as much of that now as I used to.
That's really fascinating. I didn't know anything about that at all. And it kind of almost makes me wonder, does lifestyle then depend on it? If you are someone who tries to be a voracious reader or learner and you try to implement new things, new experiences into your life regularly versus just kind of going about the same routine, having the same drive to and from work, having completely just days that you can't really distinguish from other days, that then that's impacting your sleep because your brain doesn't have to like sort more into the filing cabinet of life. And I didn't really make that connection before, that that's what those stages of sleep are for. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's a really good point you bring up as well. So we can look at the brain as a very pliable part of our body. And a lot of people get very concerned when they're not sleeping that it's going to impact their brain. And one of the qualifications that I have is through my health coaching practice that I incorporate into my sleep work is specifically looking at what kinds of activities help create cognitive reserve in people. So if we have a certain amount of neurons and people are worried about their neurons because they're not sleeping, we look at three really important things that affect brain health. Sleep is one of them. Physical activity is another one, and social connection is a third one, and then
Mm.
nutrition. We can control 3 out of 4 of those things, but what do people do when they stop sleeping well? They stop exercising. they stop going out because it's harder to go out. They might make different food choices because it's simpler and faster to grab a fast food than it is to cook. Particularly with the examples that you were giving, doing the same drive every day, doing the same routine every day, um, that is less than optimal as opposed to doing something different and diverse. It's all well and good, for example, to do crossword puzzles. You're retrieving information that's already there, but it's much better for your brain and your brain health, especially if you're already concerned about it, to do things that you've never done before and to learn. To do physical activity, you can ride a stationary bike and watch television, or you could ride a stationary bike, watch television, and then do something a bit more dynamic and interactive that challenges different parts of our brain and builds up what is called this cognitive reserve. So even if sleep was having an effect, I suggest people do not over focus on these things because it doesn't help you with your sleep. But even if you are concerned about that, look at the other three categories of life that you can control and work on improving and diversifying those. And weirdly enough, focusing there instead of on your sleep will help your sleep in the long run because we're not putting the sleeplessness on a pedestal and over focusing on it.
I'm kind of starting to gain the recognition that focusing on bad sleep is a little bit like a dog chasing its tail, and that the more you try to focus on the bad sleep, the more intense it's going to get.
Absolutely. What I tell my clients is that sleep and love are in their own camp, and then everything else is in a different camp. If we try to control sleep, it's going to backfire in the same way if we try to control a relationship to be exactly what we want it to be instead of just letting it be the way it is, that also backfires. I'm sure we've all had experiences where we might have gotten a bit too over enthusiastic about a situation that wasn't right for us. It's just not going to go well. And the same thing happens with sleep.
It's a freeing concept because, or maybe it's not a freeing concept, because I think letting go of control, especially when you're the type of person who is trying to micromanage physiological things, like I think of the example of, are you familiar with Brian Johnson, the guy who says he's going
Yes.
to live
Mhm.
forever?
Yes.
So he talks about his sleep a lot. It's a thing that he is a bragging point for him, that he gets perfect sleep because he's using all of these devices to track it and whatnot. And it kind of seems counterintuitive in that point, that how can you possibly be getting rest, the only space in our life where we completely let go and shut down the conscious mind, but then you're obsessing about the unconscious mind. It does kind of have this feeling that it's consequential to be gripping so tightly to a thing that you're supposed to literally be releasing.
Yeah, it is. It's very, it runs very much against the grain of what we do in everyday life, which is if we have a problem, we use our human brain to figure out how to solve it. We watch a YouTube video and we figure out how to do the thing that we need to do, or we ask somebody for the contact that we can contact to help us do what we need to do. And sleep is by necessity a very passive process in the sense that we have to let go in order to fall asleep. Even though it's very active in our brain, the more we try to consciously make it happen, the worse it's going to be for us. And if this fellow has had perfect sleep his entire life, I'm wondering what kind of challenges that kind of person has actually had in their life, because it is evidence that the sleep system is working exactly the way it should when it's disrupted by high stress. It's working exactly the way that it should. Um, and I think that having good sleep allows us to have an easier life. Most of us can keep doing the things that we do, even if we have poor sleep. It's just that much harder. I like to see sleep as not something where we are doing all of these things so that we can tick a box that says we got X hours of sleep. We want good sleep so that we can have an easier time of doing the things that are really meaningful for us, like making really good connections and being physically active and engaging in things that we like to do, rather than just doing it for its own sake. That feels kind of a little shallow. But we do tend to in our culture worship this perfectionism that has everything go exactly the way that we want it to go. And if we look at the big five personality traits that people can do these tests that measure their levels of openness and perfectionism and all of these sorts of things. It's perfectionism is the number one personality trait that is associated with the development of insomnia,
Wow.
independent of anxiety disorders, independent of those sorts of things. Perfectionists and people who like to see things being very controlled are most at risk, because what's going to happen when your sleep wobbles and you're going to start worrying about it and trying to make it just right again. And that's that recipe for that vicious circle.
Hmm. Can you talk to me about whether there is a significance? What is that significance to our quality of sleep when we are experiencing dreams and then lucid dreams and then nightmares?
Ooh. So a lot of people will experience really intense dreams, and that intensity, they feel like that is disrupting their sleep quality. I think that might be kind of what you're getting at. The emotional tone could be very different in a lucid dream that could be very positive, and the emotional tone of a nightmare is typically very negative. And so the word nightmare comes from the negative connotation. Both can be habitually had. So it's almost like there's a switch that gets flicked in the brain, and the brain says, oh, about this cycle in the night I do this, and I have this really intense emotional experience, and then the emotion of the experience makes it more likely to happen again in the future. That can actually
Hmm.
be reprogrammed. There are evidence-based behavioral medicine approaches to reworking that. Whether or not it has an effect on people's overall sleep quality across the board, I'm not aware of studies on that. There probably are some studies on that, but the key thing is that it has a subjective impact on people's quality of sleep, and that people's quality of sleep is much more important than their quantity of sleep, because it's the quality of sleep that dictates how we function in the world the next day. If I asked a room full of people, would you rather have 8, 9 hours of broken sleep where it took you ages to fall asleep and then you're awake 4 times in the night and it took you 9 hours to kind of have that experience? Or would you rather have 6 hours of really good sleep? Most people would take the 6 hours of really good sleep. And in sleep therapy, when we take somebody who has really broken sleep and we consolidate it, they might not be getting the number of hours that's ideal for them, but they feel better during the day because their sleep quality is better.
That makes perfect sense. I would love to hear your thoughts on medications such as melatonin, Ambien, trazodone, whatever people are using, whether it's prescription or over the counter. Is that just a band aid? Is that helping? What are the timelines people should be looking at when they're adding those to their routine?
Yeah, if we look at the recommendations made by all major medical and sleep associations around the world, I'm talking about every country: United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Australia, all UK, all of them, the number one recommended treatment for chronic insomnia is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It's not medication.
Mm,
Um, and one of the issues with that, some of it's awareness. GPs get about 2 hours of sleep education in their entire career, unless they have special interest in it and they go on and they study more. It's much cheaper for a system built on short appointments to give prescriptions. So that's just what the evidence shows, and that it's sleep therapy is effective for over 85% of people for whom it's suitable. And then the next level down in these recommendations is, if that hasn't helped, then try these things. And that includes things like melatonin, because melatonin isn't indicated for insomnia, but people pop it like a sleeping pill. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second, because it's one of my favorite things to talk about. Um, so it's not the medications are not the number one recommended intervention. They are intended for short-term use only. And I strongly feel, and I know a lot of sleep physicians that I know in my particular world strongly feel, that when somebody is given a prescription for sleeping medication, there needs to be a plan for how and when to come off of that medication, because it is a band-aid. They do not create real sleep. Some of them actually interfere with slow wave sleep and REM sleep. But what they do is they sedate somebody. So you're not going to be worried, anxious, distressed if you are half sedated. Right. So that's one way that there are lots of different mechanisms of action for different classes of medication, but all of them except one, essentially, they function as more like a sedative. So if people are getting a medication, particularly if it's a habituating one that can become habit forming, you need to go in with the end in mind. What is the plan for coming off of that in a way that's psychologically neutral? Because people can become psychologically dependent on anything, including melatonin. It's not habituating in that sense, but people become afraid to stop taking something that they've associated with sleep, whether it's been properly associated with sleep or their brain has just said, "Ooh, I slept after I took that, so it must mean that sleep lives in this little pill." So I think there are a number of issues at hand. Personally, I'm medication agnostic. People can be on medication and do sleep therapy. They can be off of it and do sleep therapy. They can be tapering it and doing sleep therapy. But what is tricky is if people are taking it sometimes just in case, because that gives a lot of power to the fear of not sleeping. And it becomes what we call a safety behavior. It's like it's an escape. And it's not necessarily what people think it's escape. It's not escaping sleeplessness. It's a way to escape the anxiousness around not sleeping, and so that anxiety becomes the proxy. So they're treating the anxiety, but they're doing it in a way that's actually increasing their anxiety over time. So what we call contingent use, just in case, or, because I've got a big thing tomorrow, or I didn't sleep well the last couple nights, so I'm really afraid to not sleep tonight. That gives a lot of weight to the sleeplessness. Things like melatonin are fascinating. Here in the UK, it's not available over the counter like it is in the States. There have been a number of studies that have looked at what's actually in over the counter melatonin and other kinds of supplements associated with sleep. And the results are not good. What's actually on the label is not often what's in the bottle. They're not regulated like pharmaceuticals. They're regulated as food supplements, and that regulation level is a lot looser. And so you may have 1% of the amount that you think's in there. You may have 200% of the amount that's in there. You could have other contaminants like serotonin, which are really dangerous to take in that bottle, and you just don't know it. So if people are taking anything, I strongly urge you to avoid the cheap big box store brands. Get something that is third party tested. So even if it's not appropriate, and most people don't take it appropriately, at least you know what's in the bottle. Um, with melatonin, it's not indicated for insomnia, but it is indicated for things like jet lag and circadian rhythm management. If people have to say they're naturally a night owl, we can use light therapy and melatonin to help shift people's circadian rhythm. Our brain is the most sensitive to things like melatonin 4 to 6 hours before we typically get sleepy. And so it will be prescribed in a very tiny dose to be taken well before. When somebody tells me um, they take their melatonin and they're asleep in 5 minutes, I say that's the power of placebo. Because they're now no longer worried about whether they're going to sleep, because they've taken their magic pill and their arousal drops, and then voila, because they haven't been sleeping well, they fall asleep, because it doesn't act that way. At high doses, it can be a sedative, but it still takes time. Just as a guideline, most prescribers will prescribe 0.5 milligram and then work up from there. But if you go and you buy these bottles with 10 milligrams of you don't know what's in it, that's not how the body doesn't use most of that. So if you're paying more because it's got a bigger milligram number on it, your body's wasting that anyway. So save your money, buy something third party tested if you're going to do it at all. My recommendation is, from a psychological point of view, from a dependence point of view, I would look at melatonin the same way I would look at another medication, because people's psychological dependence on it can be so strong.
Similar to that, do you have feelings about or takes on using marijuana as a sleep aid?
From a psychological point of view, I would pop it into the same category. Again, it's not legal here. People use it. Again, you kind of, I guess, chill out. I've never used it myself, but this is just anecdotes from things I have heard. It reduces our tendency to be worried or anxious about things. I think with something like smoking anything, you have the additional concerns of what are you breathing into your lungs. So that is a factor for some people who might be more disposed to having um, lung disease if they breathe enough of that in.
Sure. I want to talk about people's obsession with light because
Ooh.
lately there's so much rhetoric about don't have your phone in the room, don't look at blue light X amount of hours before bed, you better have blackout curtains, you better not have a night light or, some kind of little light on your computer if it's in the room with you. Should we be demonizing light like this, or is it an exaggeration?
I'm so glad you asked this question. So, um, darkness is not required for sleep. So, if anybody's watching the video of this show, I'm standing in my window in my bedroom, and it's broad daylight in the UK right now from about 4:30 in the afternoon until about 10 at night, and we never pull the blind, and I sleep just fine. All know people who've fallen asleep in the park. It's not a requirement. So I think we tend to demonize light in that sense. And there's nothing wrong with pulling a blind to keep light out if you have better sleep quality. If you're going so far as to tape your blinds to the wall to keep every photon of light out, then it's your fear keeping you awake, not the light. But when we're talking about devices, there has been a lot of demonizing of devices. And there are a couple of different ways to look at this. There was a study done a number of years ago where they looked at the impact of 5 hours on a laptop, which is very bright light, and its impact on our melatonin onset. And they picked 5 hours because most people's dim light melatonin onset, which is supposed to help start the sleep cycle off, happens in that 4 to 6 hour range. So they looked at people's laptop use, plopped a bunch of people in a lab, said, use your laptop for 5 hours, and then we're going to measure your melatonin as you go and see what happens. And 5 hours of bright laptop use did impact people's dim light melatonin onset. But what they didn't do is they didn't actually study the sleep itself. So everybody
Hmm.
assumed, well, if it affects your dim light melatonin onset, then it's going to affect people's ability to fall asleep. But they didn't actually study that. And it turns out that when you do add that layer in, even when people's dim light melatonin onset's delayed, it was delayed by about an hour and a half in that study for 5 hours of light. The difference in the groups of people who were exposed to the light and those who weren't was on the order of like 3 or 4 minutes to fall asleep. So, fast forward, people might say, "Oh, well, it's not necessarily the light. Then maybe it's what you're doing. Maybe if it's really exciting, that could be a problem." But they also studied this. They took a group of people, put them into different groups. One of them had to read documentaries or had to watch documentaries on television. The group got to play first person shooter video games. Again, there's very little difference between the groups. The thing that is an issue, I think, with screens approaching bedtime is that people can't put them down and
Hmm.
give themselves enough sleep opportunity. So it isn't it's keeping them awake because of the interest in what is happening, and they're using it past when they would normally fall asleep. So of course it's then affecting how much they sleep, rather than looking at some of these other issues like the blue light and how exciting it is. And just for giggles, there are also studies looking at iPhones and iPhones without the warm light filter, or whatever it's called on the device, the night mode, and with night mode. And there's also no difference. And that is primarily because a phone doesn't emit enough light to have an impact. It's really kind of bright
Mm.
screens like laptops. So a lot of parents out there will probably be really annoyed with these facts because they're trying to get their kids to put down their iPads and go to bed. um, People who are more likely to get into flow states, um, are more at risk of having devices impact their sleep because they can't put them down. So people who are really high on the dopamine content that they're getting from what they're doing, particularly more sensitive, like maybe ADHD populations being more sensitive to getting that additional dopamine hit from their device. If you had to pick what is the most innocuous screen you can look at before bed, it would be old-fashioned television, where you have to
Mhm.
scroll through the channels and change the channels. If anybody has one of those things anymore, I remember when I was a kid, you have to get up and you have to poke the button on the box to make it. Now we can scroll through. It's got algorithms. It's, oh, would you like to watch this? Would you like to watch that? Anything algorithmic makes it a little more likely that it's going to interfere with the sleep that you could have gotten if you were just making a decision, am I sleepy enough to watch the next thing or not? So yeah, devices get a bad rap. Parents want devices to have a bad rap because it helps shore up their arguments for putting the iPads down for little kids. But unfortunately, the evidence is not the way it's been presented. Now, I personally think it's a nice idea to do something different at night that isn't screen based, because we spend most of our days on a screen and our brain likes the variety of experience. It's good for us. Yeah, that's how I view the whole screen dilemma.
I like that myself, but not for a good reason, but because I scroll TikTok right before bed. And then I also will put on like a guided meditation as I'm falling asleep. So, just
Mhm.
in my own experience, I haven't had any kind of complications with using the screen. I don't do it on any kind of night mode or anything like that. And it definitely is about just like scrolling and getting that dopamine hit. Intuitively, to me, getting a dopamine hit, of course, this is anecdotal because, again, my sleep is good, but it hasn't impacted me. And my kind of hypothesis on it is, well, why would dopamine interrupt sleep right before sleep? Because aren't people also having sex right before sleep? And
Mhm.
that's dopamine, and that's not interrupting anything either. So that's just kind of my hypothesis. So
Yeah.
I feel like you just backed me up a little bit with the phone thing.
Yeah, I have been known to be looking at my phone and to drop it on my face because I'm on Instagram. So it doesn't affect. I mean, again, that's n of one. It's just me. Um, yeah, I enjoy having a little look at. I like to knit and I'm into gardening, and so I'll look at some plant videos and I've occasionally dropped it on my face. And then what I do is I say, oh, I guess I'm sleepy. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to put it away. What we want to discourage people from doing, more problematic, is you wake up in the middle of the night and you don't know what to do with yourself. And so then you start scrolling, and then it keeps you
Hmm.
engaged when you might otherwise be feeling sleepy enough to fall back to sleep. So I'd say that's a little bit more problematic than if you're already awake and it might be delaying you a little bit.
That makes sense. Do you have any strong feelings about sharing a bed with a pet?
Hmm. In the sleep therapy world, they like to discourage that. However, the practicalities of taking a pet that is used to sleeping in bed with you and changing their behavior can create a lot of drama. So I would say it for people who sleep well, it's not an issue. For people who don't sleep well and you don't have a pet and then you get a pet, it would be ideal to not have that begin having that pet sleep with you, because that could create lots of additional issues. If you don't sleep well, you already have a pet in your bed. Extracting them creates another hurdle. So if it's not simple or straightforward, if you put them out of the room and they're going to whine all night long, um, that obviously creates difficulties unless you're an animal behaviorist and you know exactly how to sort that out relatively quickly. That is an option. You can get an animal behaviorist in and you can sort those sorts of things out relatively, um, from their point of view, relatively easily. Us humans in the ordinary world, we're not nearly as consistent with our pets as we would need to be to achieve that quickly. So it's not realistic to do for most people. So I'd say if you're already in a situation like that with a pet in the bed and you sleep great, don't worry about it. If you don't sleep well, don't invite a pet in. And if you don't sleep well and you've already got a pet there, I would say embark on your sleep therapy journey with the pet and then see where we go from there.
Okay, good. Straightforward, lots of options. I like that.
Hmm.
On a similar kind of note, if you're someone who's a sensitive sleeper and you're maybe entering a new relationship, or you're just getting to a place where maybe you're moving in together and all of a sudden you have to share a bed, what's the etiquette for dealing with being sensitive and inviting somebody else into your sleep habitat?
That's such an interesting question because when I first met my partner, we were traveling. I was traveling out to spend time with him, and I had to get to the point where I'd been on my own for a long time, and I just accepted that I wasn't going to sleep on the weekend. And eventually I got over it. It was kind of a time and grade exercise. I didn't overreact to the not sleeping. I just decided it was not going to get in the way of the time that we were spending together on the weekends. It was not going to go sleep on the sofa, for example. So for us, me kind of just battling through it and eventually come out the other side. And now when he travels for work, I have difficulty sometimes sleeping because he's not here.
Mm.
So it goes both ways. Um, the etiquette issue, it's really interesting that it's framed that way because a lot of people who have the person who has difficulty sleeping often feels really sensitive to disrupting the other person. The other person sometimes feels concerned that they are disrupting the person who's not sleeping. So that's really a very individual thing. I get this question sometimes in the shape of what they call like a quote unquote sleep divorce. Should people sleep separately? It's a really personal decision to make between the two parties, and whatever etiquette is makes both parties feel okay is the best thing to do, because what we don't want is the disruption to be corrosive to the rest of the relationship.
Perfectly stated. That makes sense. I know people who it's not an issue for, and I'm also friends with a couple who, through I think the majority of their relationship, have slept in separate bedrooms because they both have issues, and that's just how it is. So when they travel, they get hotel rooms that have two beds, and it just works better for them. So,
Yeah, and really interesting. Sometimes I feel like almost like the universe has set up a situation where lots of night owls and lots of early birds end up together.
hmm.
And sometimes that can create a little bit of disruption. But what I've found is that the disruption is not necessarily with the sleep piece. It's more with I've been awake for 6 hours and this person isn't up yet, and now half my day is gone. This kind of disruption. So sometimes it looks like a sleep difference, but it's actually the difference is having an impact elsewhere, and that the differences in chronotype is more problematic than say a difference between somebody who sleeps well and somebody who has insomnia. You would think, well, it's just going to be easier, but changing somebody who's an early bird into a night owl or vice versa is a really challenging thing to do. So it becomes more of a relationship management issue than a sleep management issue.
So we've talked about light and we've talked about phones and medications. What are things that maybe we haven't touched on that are actually ruining and depleting the quality of sleep?
When we think about sleep, a lot of times we think about the sleep cycle beginning kind of like in the couple of hours before bed. Really, the sleep cycle biologically and psychologically starts when we get up in the morning.
Mm.
And this comes in a lot of different ways. Is true in a lot of different ways. It's true biologically. So the buildup of our sleep drive and sleep pressure starts in the morning when we get up. The anchoring of our circadian rhythm starts when we get up in the morning. And if you've ever woken up on the wrong side of the bed, even if you don't know why you've woken up on the wrong side of the bed, and you have a day that reflects waking up on the wrong side of the bed, that can have an impact on your sleep. So, psychologically, the way we start the day and where we choose to put emphasis on our experience, we can choose to focus on the negative things or how we feel if we've had a rough night, or we can choose to focus on other things that sets us up for the rest of the day. The other thing I think that is often missed out is the importance of personal boundaries and creating compartments throughout the day. So, having a little bit of time for yourself in the morning, even if it's 5 minutes before you start giving out all of your energy to the rest of the world. having a break in the middle of the day where you're not necessarily eating lunch at the desk and frantically trying to catch up on emails. It's like you really compartmentalize that time for yourself. And then you give work a compartment, and then you give your evening a compartment that's for the family, and then an evening compartment that's just for you. This makes it easier when you have challenges with sleep to compartmentalize things that are not helpful for you because you've already been practicing. "Oh, this is my time for me. This is my time for my work. This is my time for my friend. And then this is my time for me in the evening." Makes it easier to keep the maybe negative things that we might otherwise carry through the day, gives them their own space because those things are going to happen, but we don't necessarily drag them then into our nighttime.
Do you have a preferred sleep hygiene that you like to recommend to people? Do we need a pillow between our knees, the mask, the this, the that? Like, talk to me about the sleep hygiene that you would prescribe to me if I needed it.
Right. So when we talk about people who have insomnia, who are usually the people who come to me, sleep hygiene isn't helpful once somebody's already stuck in that arousal trap. It can be a little bit of icing on the cake, but what happens is if people are terrified of not sleeping, they don't just get a blackout blind. They tape it to the walls, right? So you can take these things overboard. What I tend to recommend for, if we're talking about in the evening, kind of like immediately before bedtime, if you live in a place that's really bright, or you live on a ground floor where you're going to have headlights and things interrupting your sleep from the outside, um, having some kind of way to cancel out some of that noise, whether it's double glazed windows, whether it's maybe earplugs. When I travel, I wear noise canceling earphones because I'm a very light sensitive sleeper to external noise. But if I forget them, I'm not panicked about it. I just kind of like, oh, I'm going to have a rough sleep. That's the difference. So trying to keep things quiet is helpful. There are some studies that show that sleep quality in good sleepers is improved by wearing a mask. So from that point of view, a little bit of darkness can be helpful. That It's not so helpful for people once they have insomnia because the insomnia is being driven from the inside. So some of these common things are neutral unless they're overlaid with fear. So having a dark room, um, uh, trying to keep things a little bit quiet, keeping a room a little cooler is hugely helpful. And I recommend that for everybody. As we were talking about before, there's no air conditioning here in the UK. If I told you what the conversion was to North American to Fahrenheit temperatures, you might not think it's very hot, but we don't have any air conditioning. So we have to sleep in this heat and 80% humidity, and it makes it very challenging to get our deepest point before we start transitioning to wakefulness for the day. We have to achieve a lower body temperature, and it's simply harder if it's hot and it's humid and so we can't sweat, or if we're frustrated, or if you're my age, you're having night sweats because you have menopause. So keeping things a little bit cooler. So we're talking maybe 17°C. I'm not exactly sure what the Fahrenheit conversion is. I'd have to check.
Me neither.
Yeah, little bit cooler than you would be comfortable with if you were sitting in light clothing still in a room for a longer period of time. I think that one's probably the most important of the three, between darkness, quiet, and temperature. The temperature is the more important one.
That's fascinating, but it makes sense, I guess, because our bodies just kind of want to be in that cooler. Like, there is something so uncomfortable about being hot versus, I think, even if the room is too cold, then you can pile on with blankets and there's this like coziness factor that sets in.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, people sometimes ask me, well, how do you sleep? You're a sleep
Hmm.
therapist. I can tell you last night it was hot and sticky and I didn't sleep very well. It's nothing I can really do about that.
So, if someone is going through a bout of insomnia, what are kind of the first steps that they should look into for resolving it?
Right. First thing would be to ditch the trackers for all of the reasons that we've already talked about. Second thing would be to resist the temptation to take naps, resist the temptation to sleep in after a rough sleep. One of the first things we do in sleep therapy is eliminate naps and start the
Wow.
day at the same time every single day. It's not forever, but to really anchor the building of that sleep drive and that circadian system, and then to get light food and movement first thing in the morning. There are additional things to layer on top of that if they are necessary. But for most people, if they're having kind of a, maybe they've had a wobbly sleep and it's wobbling a little bit too long, those would be the first things that a person could do, and they are safe for everybody to do. There are additional things that we would do in a one-to-one setting. They're not appropriate for everybody. They need to be heavily modified for some people, but those foundations, again, if we're looking at the sleep cycle, it starts in the morning, and that buildup of sleep drive, which we take a dent out of if we take a long nap in the afternoon, which we take a dent out of if we have a lie in the morning. We want to minimize those variables and keep that really consistent, and that's the first place to start. Sometimes that's enough, and then you can ease back off.
So you're anti-nap?
I am anti nap for people who have insomnia, as long as they are not sleepy during the daytime and they have to drive somewhere.
Hmm.
So there are caveats, right? So I can take a nap. I'm not anti nap, to like flat out anti nap, but if people are trying to work on their insomnia, taking a nap will slow their progress. If people have to nap for safety, i.e., you're most people with insomnia don't feel sleepy during the daytime. But if you happen to feel sleepy during the daytime, if you got to go for a drive and it's not going to be safe for you, take a nap, right? That's the safety is the bottom line. But you can take the edge off of the sleepiness with a short 25-minute nap, set an alarm, and have it as early in the day as possible. And if you sleep for 20 minutes, make sure you go to bed 20 minutes later so you can make up the build, that sleep drive that was lost by taking the nap. Not
I've heard
medical
the
advice, but that's just that's the principles of how it works.
and that makes sense too, is that you're trying to get back on this circadian rhythm first and foremost. I've heard these kind of tales of, I don't know if it was Nikolai Tesla or somebody else that was like kind of doing this intermittent sleep schedule that sounds absolutely insane, where he would work for an hour, sleep for 20 minutes, work for, and just never do like a long stretch, like an 8 hour stretch of sleep. I have no idea if that's, a historically accurate representation of him, but it sounds like that's not the way that we're built to sleep.
In general, we're not, but there are sleep disorders that might manifest that way.
Mm.
So there's insomnia. There are also 85 plus other sleep disorders. If we look at circadian rhythm issues, the timing of sleep, yeah, there are night owls and early birds. I don't really consider that technically they're a disorder, but they're a disorder because those people struggle to fit in the 9 to 5 society that we've created, not for any other reason. But there are circadian rhythm disorders where their brain is sometimes saying it's awake, sometimes saying it's asleep, and they have issues with their sleep wake timing across a 24-hour period. If you took a person who was sighted and had a stable circadian rhythm and you put them in a dark room for an extended period of time, their cycle, because they've lost the light, will begin to shift and you would just slowly advance. You'd become more and more of an early bird. You could actually have the person's sleep cycle go right round the clock, um, like almost like free running. But there are non 24 sleep disorders where sleep happens in weird patches throughout a 24-hour period. Well beyond the scope of the stuff that I work with. This is more like I read about it a couple times type stuff. But there are circadian rhythm biologists who study this, and there are lots and lots of different sleep disorders. If he didn't consider it problematic, he probably never asked anybody to help him out with it. Um, that's one of the, I think, key, like the bottom line in the diagnostics is, and it causes distress. But we can
Oh,
all
okay.
probably think of things that really aren't very healthy that don't obviously cause people distress. We humans are really great at trying to minimize the distress of unhealthy things that we do. Um,
As you were saying, this might be more of an anthropological question, but is the different circadian rhythms that we have, is that a byproduct of a lineage where someone long ago was like the night watch of our family and that DNA gets passed down? And so we're more of night owls because somebody was the lookout. I don't know if there's any accuracy to that, but it's like a cool thing to think about.
yeah, it is a really cool thing to think about. I don't think they know the answer to that one. With the exception that it does appear to be our baseline rhythm and how much sleep we need does appear to be, at least in great part, if not all part, genetically determined. So there might be something to that. Um, what makes a species really robust is its variability. And so, if there was, say, hypothetically, night owls were a tendency that was strongly passed down through generations, and early birds were something that was passed down strongly through generations. It only does that because it served a purpose at some point. Whether it serves a purpose now is up for debate, because we spend most of our time indoors and not getting those natural signals that would have an influence, and not needing kind of protection from the wolves. Um, but there are a lot of things about us that we work in, constantly a work in progress as a species. And if those things don't continue to serve us, they will eventually go away.
Maybe your perception on this is skewed because you're obviously working with the people who have the sleep disorders, but I'm wondering how many people are you actually encountering? Like, what would you say is the percentage of people that have like a diagnosable sleep disorder?
The statistics show probably between 15 and 20%, depending on the population you're looking at one time, have potentially a diagnosable insomnia. If we're looking at other sleep disorders on top of that, I would say that I don't know what that number is, but that number is getting bigger, because I know, for example, obstructive sleep apnea is on the rise. And if we look just across a short period of time, as women get older, we become more likely to develop obstructive sleep apnea and restless leg syndrome, and a variety of other things, because of our hormonal changes. Even if we don't have weight gain and some of the other things that are associated, our hormonal changes make us more prone to obstructive sleep apnea, for example. So if we're taking all the sleep disorders and lumping them together, I don't know, but that's probably on the rise simply because of that one element. The numbers of people with obstructive sleep apnea is on the rise.
And obviously, with insomnia, it is something that can be solved with coaching and with methods that you're implementing. Is sleep apnea, that's not curable, is it? You just have to hook yourself up to a device, and is that your only option?
It's treatable, and when people are concerned about the health consequence, everybody hears about the health consequences of poor sleep. We're not thinking insomnia actually with that. But of course, it's the people with insomnia who are scrolling on their phones at night reading about that. It is sleep apnea, and there are different types of sleep apnea. Obstructive sleep apnea, a central sleep apnea, which comes from the brain rather than from an obstruction, and then a mixed type, which is a little bit of both. Completely treatable, and for the obstructive sleep apnea, it's completely treatable and completely reverses the risk profile that's created by having the sleep apnea. And a lot of people get worried about having a sleep apnea diagnosis because they imagine they're going to have to wear this giant Darth Vader mask on their face.
Mhm.
There are so many different kinds of devices and interventions now that don't require you to wear scuba equipment. There are smaller things. There are dental devices. If you have mild sleep apnea, there are other ways that it can be managed. And even if you are in a category where you need to have some airway pressure to maintain your airway at night, there are there are ways to get used to wearing the mask. It's not like they expect you to just put it on and then sleep. If you gave me a mask, even if it was small and unobtrusive and comfortable, if you asked me to sleep with something on my face tonight, I wouldn't be able to do it. So there are ways that people get trained to use it and get used to it so that it doesn't become an issue. So I would really urge anybody who thinks that they might have a non insomnia sleep disorder to get assessed. And how might you know you have a non insomnia sleep disorder? Um, the difference between insomnia and all other sleep disorders is that insomnia is characterized by this arousal, which sometimes makes it hard to sleep even in the daytime. Other sleep disorders, in particular, so something like sleep apnea, people are pathologically sleepy and are falling asleep all day long. They have no problem falling asleep. They might wake up a million times at night and then fall back to sleep, but they are literally falling asleep after lunch, sitting quietly as a passenger in a car. Um, People who are sleepy like that need to get assessed, A, for medical issues that may be causing this, but especially for sleep disorders that can be treated.
I want to end on a positive note for people that are going through conflict right now with their sleep. What's your favorite piece of advice?
There is hope for everybody, that they can reconnect to their natural ability to sleep. It can feel really far away and really impossible, especially if you felt your confidence has been knocked by trying lots and lots and lots of things. If you have tried everything and you haven't tried sleep therapy, speak to somebody who has, and speak to a practitioner who can assess you. Don't be afraid of what you read about online. People in the real world are not like they are in labs. What you're reading about was done in the laboratory. It's delivered very differently with a bit of a coaching flair. We want to set you up for success so that you can reconnect to that natural ability to sleep. That arousal may be in the way at the moment and may be clouding your connection, but it is absolutely there. The fact that you're not sleeping well and you have insomnia is actually showing us that your sleep system is working exactly the way it should. So don't be afraid and ask for help.
Thank you so much. Tracy Hannigan, if people want to work with you, how can they find more?
You can find me online, most social media platforms at Tracy the Sleep Coach. And my website is tracythesleepcoach.co.uk. And if anybody wants to have a chat to see if working with me might be the right thing for them, I offer a free 20-minute chat as well. No pressure.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It was a great chat.
Yes, it was. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Bye.
Bye.